during the Atlantean age, it was possible for some individuals to be entangled in the world of the senses to a minimal extent. This transformed the Luciferic influence from an obstacle to human evolution into an instrument of further progress that put these individuals in a position to develop their knowledge of earthly things earlier than would have been possible otherwise. As part of this process, these people attempted to eliminate error from their mental activity and to discover the original intentions of spiritual beings in the phenomena of the world. They kept themselves free of urges and desires of the astral body that were directed only towards the world of the senses, and thus they became increasingly free of the astral body's errors. The conditions this brought about in them led them to perceive only with the part of the life body that was separate from the physical ID. Under these conditions, the physical body's perceptive capacity was wiped out, so to speak, and the physical body itself seemed dead. Through their life bodies, these human beings then united completely with the domain of the spirits of form, who showed them how they were being led and guided by the exalted being who had assumed leadership during the separation of sun and earth, and who was later to make human beings receptive to understanding Christ. These individuals were initiates. However, because human individualities had entered the domain of the Luciferic beings, as a rule even these initiates could not be directly touched by the great sun spirit, who could only be shown to them by the moon spirits as if in a reflection. They saw only the sun beings' reflected glory. These individuals became leaders of the other human beings and were able to communicate to them the mysteries they had beheld. They attracted disciples whom they taught how to attain the state leading to initiation. Their knowledge, previously revealed through Christ, could be acquired only by people who were sun humanity in the sense indicated. Activate 6 Go to setting above. They nurtured their mysterious knowledge and the practices that led to it in a special place which we can call the Christ Oracle or Sun Oracle. Oracle, that is, in the sense of a place where the intentions of spiritual beings are perceived. What is said here about Christ will be misunderstood unless we consider the fact that supersensory knowledge necessarily sees the appearance of Christ on earth as an event that was foretold by those who were already aware of the meaning of the Earth's evolution prior to this event. It would be a mistake to assume that these initiates had a relationship to Christ that would be possible only later, after his actual appearance on earth. However, they were able to grasp in a prophetic way and make comprehensible to their disciples that anyone touched by the power of the sun being sees Christ approaching the earth. Other oracles were called into being by Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter humans. The vision of the initiates of each group was directed upwards only as far as the being who could be discerned as the corresponding higher eye in the life bodies of the members of their group. This is how the wisdom of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars acquired followers. In addition to these methods of initiation, there were also methods for those who had absorbed too much of the Luciferic principle, which prevented as large a part of their life body from separating from the physical body as was the case in sun humanity. In these people, the astral body retained more of the life body in the physical body, and they were incapable of being brought to a prophetic revelation of Christ by means of the conditions we have described. Because of the Luciferic principle's greater influence on their astral bodies, they had to undergo more difficult preparations before being able, in a less body-free state than the others, to behold the other higher beings, though not Christ. Among the beings they were able to see, however, were certain ones who, although they had left the earth when the sun separated from it, were not yet at a level that would have permitted them to participate in the sun's evolution for any length of time. After the sun's separation from the earth, these beings pulled Venus out of the sun in order to make it their dwelling place. The being who became their leader also became the higher ego of the group of initiates, and their followers described above. Something similar happened with the leading spirit of Mercury with regard to humans of a different type. This is how the Venus and Mercury oracles came about. Human beings of the particular type who had absorbed the most Luciferic influence were able to reach up only as far as the leader of the beings who had been the first to be expelled from the sun's evolution. This being did not occupy a particular planet in cosmic space, but lived in the surroundings of the Earth itself, having reunited with it after returning from the sun. This being manifested as the higher ego of human beings who can be called followers of the Vulcan Oracle. Their vision was directed more towards earthly phenomena than was the case with the other initiates, and they laid the first foundations for what later became the arts and sciences among human beings. In contrast, the Mercury initiates laid the basis for knowledge of more supersensory things, and the Venus initiates did this to an even greater extent. The fact that the Vulcan, Mercury, and Venus initiates received their knowledge more in the form of their own thoughts and ideas distinguished them from the Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars initiates, who received their mysteries more as a revelation from above and in a more finished state. The Christ initiates occupied the middle ground, receiving the ability to clothe their mysteries in human concepts along with their direct revelations. The Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars initiates had to express themselves in symbols to a greater extent, while the Christ, Venus, Mercury, and Vulcan initiates were more able to communicate through concepts. What reached Atlantean humanity in this way happened indirectly, by way of the initiates. However, the rest of humankind also received special faculties as a result of the Luciferic principle, because the exalted cosmic beings transformed certain faculties that might otherwise have led to ruin into a blessing. One such faculty was speech. Human beings are evolved as a result of the densification into physical, material nature and the separation of part of the life body from the physical body. During the time following the moon's separation, human beings at first felt united with their physical ancestors through the group ego. But this common consciousness connecting descendants and ancestors was gradually lost over the course of the generations. Later descendants had an inner memory that no longer reached back to their earlier ancestors, but only to not very distant ones. People's memories of one or the other ancestor appeared only during contact with the spiritual world in their sleep-like states. They were then likely to feel at one with their ancestors. They believed these ancestors had reappeared in themselves. This was an erroneous idea of reincarnation that emerged primarily in the last part of the Atlantean age. The truth about reincarnation could only be experienced in the schools of the initiates. Only the initiates, who saw human souls in the body-free state passing from one incarnation to another, were able to communicate the truth about this to their disciples. At the point in the distant past that we are talking about here, the human physical figure was still very different from how it is now. To a great extent, it was still the expression of soul characteristics. Human beings still consisted of matter that was softer and more delicate than what they acquired later. What is solid today was then still soft, supple, and malleable. Human beings with more pronounced soul and spiritual elements were delicate, mobile, and expressive in their bodily structure, while those who were spiritually less developed had body forms that were coarse, immobile, and less malleable. Advancement on a soul level contracted the limbs and kept a person's stature small, while delayed soul development and entanglement and sensuality expressed itself in gigantic size. During their growth period, people's bodies took shape according to what was forming in their souls in a way that seems incredible, or even fantastic to our modern way of looking at things. Moral depravity in a person's passions, drives, and instincts resulted in a gigantic increase in material substance. Our present human physical form came about through contracting, densifying, and solidifying the Atlantean one. Prior to the Atlantean age, human beings were faithful copies of their soul, character, but the causes that led to the post-Atlantean human form, which is solid and relatively independent of any soul qualities, were inherent in the processes of Atlantean evolution. The animal kingdom on Earth became dense in its forms much earlier than human beings. Under no circumstances can the laws currently governing the way that forms take shape in the kingdoms of nature be extended to the distant past. Towards the middle of the Atlantean age, a great disaster was gradually building up within humankind. The secrets of the initiates should have been carefully protected from individuals who had not prepared their astral bodies to receive this knowledge by cleansing them of error. When such people did acquire an insight into this hidden knowledge, into the laws through which higher beings guided the forces of nature, they used these laws for purposes that served their aberrant needs and obsessions. The danger became even greater when these people entered the domain of the lower spiritual beings who could not participate in the Earth's normal evolution and worked against it. These beings were constantly influencing human beings by promoting interests that actually worked contrary to human benefit. At that time, human beings still had the ability to use the natural growth and reproductive forces of animals and humans for their own purposes. Not only ordinary people but also some initiates succumbed to the temptations provided by the lower spiritual beings, and used these supersensory forces in the service of aims that ran counter to humanity's evolution. To carry this out, they chose associates who were not initiates, and who used the mysteries of nature's supersensory workings exclusively for baser purposes. The consequence was great corruption among humankind. The evil spread further and further, and since the forces of growth and reproduction, when uprooted and applied out of context, have a mysterious connection to certain forces at work in air and water, these human actions released powerfully destructive natural forces. This led to the gradual destruction of the Atlantean region through catastrophes involving the Earth's air and water. The Atlanteans, at least those who did not perish in the storms, were forced to emigrate. The storms were changing the entire face of the Earth. Europe, Asia and Africa on one side and America on the other were gradually acquiring the shapes they have today. Vast numbers of emigrants headed for these lands. As far as our present situation is concerned, the most important migrations were the ones that moved eastward from Atlantis. Europe, Asia and Africa were gradually settled by descendants of the Atlanteans. Various peoples differing in their degrees of both development and corruption took up residence there. In their midst marched the initiates, who guarded the mysteries of the oracles and established centers in various regions where the services of Jupiter, Venus, and so on, were cultivated in both the good sense and the bad. The betrayal of the Vulcan mysteries had an especially negative effect, because their followers' view was the most focused on earthly circumstances. This betrayal forced human beings to become dependent on spiritual beings whose prior development made them reject everything coming from the spiritual world that had evolved as a result of the Earth's separation from the Sun. As a result of this, these beings worked specifically in the human element that resulted from having sensory perceptions that drew a veil over the spiritual element. From this point onward, these beings acquired a great deal of influence over many of the Earth's human inhabitants. This influence first made itself felt in the fact that human beings were increasingly deprived of the feeling for the spiritual. Since the size, form and flexibility of the human physical body were still to a very great extent determined by soul qualities during this period, the betrayal of the mysteries also came to light in corresponding changes in the human race. Amorphous human figures, grotesque in both size and shape, were created wherever human corruption was especially evident. Wherever supersensory forces were placed in the service of baser drives, desires and passions, such figures, however, could not persist beyond the actual Atlantean period. They died out. Physically, post-Atlantean humankind developed from Atlantean ancestors whose bodily forms had already solidified in a way that did not allow them to succumb to soul forces that were contrary to nature. There was a certain period in Atlantean evolution when the laws prevailing in and around the Earth resulted in conditions that forced human forms to solidify. Although the races of humanity that had already solidified before this period were able to continue reproducing for a long time, their bodies gradually grew so restricting for the souls incarnating into them that these races were forced to die out. In actual fact, some of these racial forms persisted into post-Atlantean times, and modified forms of the ones that remained sufficiently flexible continued to exist for a very long time. However, the ones among them that did remain flexible beyond this time tended to embody souls that had experienced the damaging influence of the betrayal of the mysteries to a very great extent. These forms were destined to die out quickly. Thus, ever since the middle of the Atlantean age, beings had been present who exerted their influence in human evolution by making human beings live their way into the physical world of the senses in an unspiritual way. This went so far that people saw phantasmagoric delusions and illusions of all sorts instead of the true form of this world. However, human beings were exposed not only to the luciferic influence, but also to the influence of those other beings we have spoken about, whose leader can be called Ahriman. This is the name that was given to this being later on during the ancient Iranian civilization. Mephistopheles is the same being. Through this influence, Human beings who had died fell into the hands of powers that made them appear like exclusively inclined towards earthly, sensory circumstances. They were increasingly deprived of their free view into the processes of the spiritual world. They were made to feel that they were in Ahriman's power and were excluded from the fellowship of the spiritual world to a certain extent. One especially significant oracle preserved the ancient service in the purest form amid the general decline. It was one of the Christ oracles, and for that reason was able to preserve not only the mystery of Christ but also the mysteries of the other oracles, since revelation of the most exalted Sun's spirit also disclosed the leading spirits of Saturn, Jupiter, and so on. The initiates of this Sun oracle knew the secret of how to generate in certain human beings the types of life body that had been possessed by the best initiates of Jupiter, Mercury, and so on. With the means at their disposal, which cannot be discussed further here, they effectively perpetuated reproductions of the best life bodies of ancient initiates, and implanted them later in suitable individuals. The Venus, Mercury, and Vulcan initiates made it possible for similar processes to take place with regard to astral bodies. In a certain period, the leading Christ initiate found himself isolated with a few associates who were only capable of receiving the secrets of the cosmos to a very limited extent, because they were naturally predisposed to having physical and life bodies with the least degree of separation between them. At that time, such individuals were the best ones to assure the further progress of humankind. Because they experienced less and less during the sleeping state, the spiritual world was increasingly closed to them, and they lacked all understanding of what had been revealed in ancient times when human beings occupied only life bodies rather than physical bodies. The individuals in the immediate environment of this leader of the Christ oracle were the most advanced with regard to the reunification of the physical body with that portion of the life body that was formerly separate from it. This reunification was gradually being accomplished among human beings as a consequence of changes that had taken place in their Atlantean home and on Earth in general. Human physical and life bodies were coinciding to an ever greater extent. As a result of this, human beings lost their previously boundless faculty of memory, and human thought life began. The part of the life body that was united with the physical body transformed the physical brain into the actual instrument of thinking. Only after this did human beings actually experience the ego within the physical body. Self-awareness awakened for the first time. To begin with, this was actually true of only a small percentage of human beings, primarily associates of the leader of the Christ oracle. The mass of human beings scattered across Europe, Asia, and Africa preserved the remnants of older states of consciousness to varying degrees and therefore experienced the supersensory world directly. The Christ initiates associates were people of highly developed intellect, but of all the people living at that time, they had the least experience in the supersensory domain. This initiate moved with them from the west to the east, to an area in Central Asia, wanting to protect them as much as possible from contact with human beings of less advanced consciousness. He educated these associates of his, and more especially their descendants, in accordance with the mysteries that were revealed to him. Thus, he trained a whole host of human beings who took to heart impulses that were in harmony with the mysteries of the Christ initiation. From among them, he selected the 7 best to receive life bodies and astral bodies that were reproductions of those of the 7 greatest Atlantean initiates. In this way, he educated one successor for each of the initiates of Christ, Saturn, Jupiter, and so on. These 7 new initiates became the teachers and leaders of the human beings who had settled in the southern part of Asia, specifically in ancient India. Since these great teachers were actually endowed with reproductions of the life bodies of their spiritual ancestors, what was present in their astral bodies, namely, the knowledge and understanding they had assimilated themselves, did not extend to what was revealed to them through their life bodies. If this revelation was to speak in them, they had to silence their own knowledge and understanding. When they did so, the exalted beings who had spoken to their spiritual ancestors also spoke through them and out of them. Other than at the times when such beings were speaking through them, these were simple people gifted with whatever degree of intellectual and emotional education they had acquired on their own.